Jesus Christ utilized it to teach a very valuable lesson that all of us need to always keep in mind in terms of the character and the nature that God would have us display. I think that takes care of the announcements and the blessing of the little children's service. Let's have one more song and then we'll have the sermon. As we have a service such as we just did and focus in on little children and the need for God's blessing and the ability to receive God's blessing, it's important that we should consider a number of things, because we have to understand that God's blessings have conditions attached. Throughout the Scriptures, we find many examples of blessings and God offering a blessing. And one of the things that is always stressed is that God's blessings are conditional, that there are things that God expects of us if we are to be a partaker of His blessings. And there is a great responsibility that comes with that. And we need to understand our little children are in a very special category, and one that we need to value and to appreciate and to understand, and to realize that we have a big part to play in determining the future for them. We find described a state of affairs described in 1 John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 19, where we're told, "We know that we are of God, and the whole world lies in wickedness." Or as today's English version renders it, or the New English version renders it, "The whole world is under the rule of the wicked one." We know that we are of God. The whole world is under the rule of the wicked one. The world is deceived. The world is caught up in something. The world is cut off and isolated from God. The world does not have a knowledge and an understanding of God and His ways. We're told in the book of Ephesians, chapter 2 and verse 2, that wherein in times past you walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now works in the children of disobedience. So we're told that Satan the devil is the influence, the power behind the throne for this world. And we live in a society that reflects Satan's influence, Satan's perspective, and the attitudes that permeate this society, the destructive attitudes. Because let's not lose sight of the fact that we are living in a society that is in its death throes. We are seeing about us the convergence of the things that all of the Scriptures talk about. We are living in the end of an age. And we are confronted with the problems that reflect a society that is in its death throes. A society that is dying and decaying. And we see a society that is very much held captive by the devil. A society that is under the influence of Satan the devil. A society, a world that is cut off from God. What about our little children as they grow up in the church? We have the opportunity as parents of bringing up our children. They live in a world just as we do, in which they are bombarded by the influence of Satan. They're very much bombarded by that influence. and it is a very broad and pervasive influence. However, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, there is a statement and it is here addressing, in this particular case, in 1 Corinthians 7, it is addressing the subject of marriage and divorce, in the Scriptures, and I don't want to get into all of that because that's not the primary point, but as Paul addresses the various categories or circumstances that can arise, he addresses the situation of people who are married and are having marital problems in the church in verses 10 and 11, and simply tells them that they should stay together, that if they can't, they may be permitted to separate, but they are then to remain unmarried and either be reconciled or simply remain unmarried. To the rest, he addresses, verse 12, he addresses the situation of those who are married to someone who is not in the church, not a believer. And in verse 12, he says, if you have a wife, if a brother has a wife that believes not, and she's willing to dwell with him, she's willing to remain as his wife and pleased to dwell with him, he should not put her away. That is not grounds to put her away because she is not a believer. And a woman that has a husband that believes not, if he's pleased to dwell with her, he's willing to be a husband to her, that she should not leave him. That's not grounds to dissolve the marriage. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. The unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. Now they are holy. So here is a situation where we find that certainly the children, as they are addressed here, when even one mate is converted, that there is a special category. There is a situation that is different. There is an access to God possessed by our children. There is a special category in which God considers them. Not in exactly the same category as the rest of the world, cut off from God, separated from God. When Peter made his statement in Acts chapter 2 in verse 38, to repent, to be baptized every one of you in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. Verse 39, for the promise is unto you and to your children, and to all that are afar off, even as many as the Lord our God shall call. So here was a promise. Here was a promise of access to God that was made available to the children of believers as they grow up and are taught and are oriented. That there is an access that is there. Now, ultimately, of course, as our children grow up, they must exercise that right of free moral agency and make some choices. Right of access doesn't guarantee that a person is going to avail themselves of that access. You know, the opportunity, it is a tremendous opportunity, and one that our children, our young people certainly need to understand that is an opportunity they have. There are things, however, that we as parents can certainly do that can and will influence the choices that our children will make. Everything we do is going to have an influence, either a positive influence or a negative influence. And there are things that we can do to exercise that influence. In Romans chapter 12, I want to focus our attention on a chapter that is commonly called the Christian living chapter because it focuses in so much on the principles of Christian living day in and day out. From this chapter, I want to extract several principles. I think we will probably take note of about 7 that are very fundamental if we are going to have the kind of influence on our children that we ought to have and that we can have. We want our children to receive God's blessing. We read in the book of Colossians and other places, the book of Revelation, as we went through in the last Bible study, we read about God's curse coming on the children of disobedience. That there is a consequence that is coming on the world. That the world will have brought upon itself. We very much desire God's blessing. We desire God's blessing in our lives, and we desire God's blessing in the lives of our children. God's blessings are conditional. God's blessings throughout the Scriptures are conditional upon obedience. Faith and obedience are at the heart and core, and the two go hand in hand together. If you have real faith, you have obedience. Someone claims that he has faith and doesn't obey, then he's got a dead faith. That's what it says in the book of James. You believe. It says you believe that back in James, you believe that God is. You think there's a God. You believe that God is. You do well, but you're not even one step up on the devil. He believes and trembles. Even the demons believe and tremble. They know there's a God. Faith without works is dead. It's not enough just to believe that God exists, just to believe that God is. It's a matter of understanding and believing that we must act on what God reveals. We must put it into practice in our lives. What can we do as parents that can influence our children in their upbringing to avail themselves of God's blessings? Let's notice as we go through Romans chapter 12, let's notice, and this is a starting point. This is the beginning point. This is the most important aspect of what you can do as a positive influence, to have a positive influence in your family. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. First and foremost, the most important thing that you can do, the starting point for everything, is to present yourself to God holy, in complete form. To completely give yourself to God. To the extent that we give ourselves to God, God can and will work through us. There was a sermon given at the Feast of Tabernacles in Pensacola in which Mr. Cloninger went through an analogy of the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. One sea is a living sea, and out of it flows the Jordan River that gives life to all of the land around. And at the other end is the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea bottles up everything that is there. And it's a dead sea. It doesn't give life, it gives death. to whatever is there. The point is, of course, that he drew the analogy that we must let God work through us, and God's way must flow out from us. The most effective that we're going to be is the extent to which we allow God to work in us completely. God governed through Moses in a unique way. He governed more directly through Moses than perhaps any other individual in the entirety of Scripture. Because why did God govern through Moses in that way? We find example after example of Moses being a man who yielded himself completely to God. He yielded himself totally and completely. When Moses surrendered to God, he completely surrendered to God. If our effectiveness as a parent, our effectiveness in any area of our life, if we are going to be effective, we've got to present ourselves to God unconditionally. If you and I try to do it ourselves, we're destined to failure. It's not in man that walks to direct his steps. Jeremiah brings that out in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 10. Oh Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man that walks to direct his steps. Solomon brings out in Proverbs about these things, that there is a way that seems right unto a man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. There are a lot of things that seem like a good idea. They seem right, seem okay. But if human reasoning is our ultimate criteria, if the way that seems right unto a man is what we rely on, we're going to fail. No matter how much we try, no matter how hard we work, no matter how much we read and study and all the things that we can do, we're going to fall short. None of us are going to do a perfect job. First and foremost, we must present ourselves to God wholly, completely. This does several things. One is the fact that is going to be the basis of the example that we set. The example that we set, and our example is going to have a big impact. If we present ourselves to God, we yield ourselves to God completely and totally, then we are taking a very constructive step toward setting the kind of example that we ought to set, toward getting out of the way and letting God work in and through us, of recognizing our insufficiency, our lack of ability to somehow be able to put it all together and make it work. Because to trust in ourselves is to make a fatal mistake. To take it into our own hands and try to do it. You know, too many times we try to do it, and then when we get into a mess, we want God to come in and bail us out and fix the mess. And we all make our messes. And ultimately, one major factor is that we must present ourselves as a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice. It needs to be holy. That certainly reflects on our conduct and the way we're to live. A sacrifice that is acceptable to God, something God will be pleased with. That we are yielding our heart and our mind. So, a starting point in our families is that we need to present ourselves to God, wholly, totally, completely. realizing that what is of value will be what God can take and make in us. God is the one who can take and make value, make of value, and bring to pass and accomplish those things. Yield ourselves to Him. Secondly, we find just going right on to the next verse. What proceeds out from that? First is an unconditional surrender to God, to completely and totally yield ourselves to Him as His instrument. Secondly is to be not conformed to this world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. To be transformed in your inner values. Yield yourself completely and totally to God, to let God work in you and work through you and govern through you. And secondly, to be transformed in your inner values. You can never transmit and teach to someone else that which you yourself don't hold deeply. Be not conformed to the world. Don't fit the mold of the world. I think we all know what conformity is. The term is used that many times there is a mold that is cast, and a pliable substance is fitted around that, and it conforms to the shape. It conforms because it is softer and more pliable. There's something hard, there's something set, something soft is fitted around that, and the result is it conforms. It fits in around, and it takes on a resemblance. We're told not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Now, what is it about the world that we're not to be conformed to? It has to do with the value base. We are living in a society whose value base is so drastically eroding that any concept of right and wrong, any concept of normalcy has sort of gotten lost. Things that would have been unthinkable even in society a matter of a few years ago are being lost. Now, ultimately the value base of this world is summarized in the book of 1 John. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, when it says, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. The world passes away, and he that does in the lust thereof, but he that does the will of God abides forever." All that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. What does it feel like? What does it look like? And to what extent is it going to impress other people? One of the primary values, part of the primary value base of society is materialism. A very materialistic set of values. Everything has a price tag attached to it. Worth and value is based on the price tag. People are judged based on how much they have, based on all these external factors. What kind of car do they drive? What brand of clothing do they have? Is that the way to judge people? Is that the way God judges people? You know, ultimately, God's going to judge. Is going to judge us. You know, Jesus Christ is coming to judge the world. What's He going to judge? Is He going to judge what how expensive a car you drove and what brand of clothes you wore and how with it you were? Is He going to judge all these external things? Is that what He's going to look at? And boy, He's really impressed. That's not going to stand you in favor with God. God looks on the heart. He looks on the inner person. That's not a value that the world holds. The world says that what has value is the external. What has value is the image you project. What has value is how much money you have. A very, very important part, if we're going to convey true values to our children, is we have to be transformed by a renewing of our mind to realize the things the world places value on are not of value. That's not where real value is. We can never convey that to our children unless we are transformed in our thinking to realize that the things that are temporary, transitory, passing away, the things that will not endure, that's not the things that are going to last. Well, the world has a very materialistic set of values, particularly our Western world, our Western society. The world has a very here and now, fleshly oriented set of values. Very short term rather than long term. That's reflected even in the state of our nation's economy. We would not be in the condition we are economically as a nation if values that reflect attitudes of greed and short-sightedness had not been pervasive. You don't run up massive debt as our nation has if you have a long-term view. But if your attitude is, I'm going to get mine, and I don't care about what happens to somebody else, then that's the kind of thing you do. You sort of have the attitude that one of the last kings of France had, King Louis XV. It was his son that was overthrown in the French Revolution, but Louis XV pursued many disastrous policies that created, in terms of taxation and many things, that created a very volatile situation, and his attitude was, après moi, le déluge. After me, the flood. I won't live to see it. Doesn't bother me. I'll die before it comes, so why should I care? It'll be after me. That was a very short-sighted view. It was destructive, ultimately, to his family and to an entire nation and to an entire continent. When you look at the horrors that, beginning with the French Revolution in 1789, the next 25 years, France never knew peace. So after the fall of Napoleon, it was just one turmoil after another. Horrible atrocities. Set in motion by individuals who simply didn't care what came later because they thought, I'll be dead. That's not a godly view of things, but it is a very short-term view that is so much reflected in our society. Short-term view. Fleshly, materialistic view. I want what I want right here, right now. I'm not concerned about the long-term consequences. When we're told, be not conformed to this world, don't fit in with a world that holds that sort of perspective. It puts a price tag on everything. There are things that are greater than a price tag. There's no price tag that you can put. When God spoke of the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31, He said her price is far above rubies. Her value is priceless. You can't put a price tag on virtue. So, the world thinks you can put a price tag on just about everything. We're told not to be conformed, not to fit in with this society, to be transformed, to be changed by a renewing of our mind, that we learn a different approach. And you can prove what is good and what is acceptable and what is the complete and perfect will of God. Don't ever let anybody kid you. Oh, well, you can't really know. Yes, you can. You certainly can. You can know what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. You can know what God wants you to do. So if we're going to really have a positive impact, we've got to present ourselves totally to God. We've got to be transformed in our inner values, or we'll never be able to transmit a different set of values to our children. We've got to reject what could be termed an egocentric view of the world. Egocentric just means a world that revolves around the self. A self-centered view. An inflated opinion of the self. That has to be rejected. You see, it says in verse 3, I say through the grace given unto me to every man that is among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith. When a person has a self-centered view, an egocentric view, a view where the world revolves around the self, that is not a proper view. And it is going to lead certainly to disruptions in the home, because it leads into a very selfish perspective. Nobody's willing to give. People make selfish decisions. Decisions that are based on what is convenient for me. Not taking into consideration the good of others, but a self-centered view. An inflated opinion of the self. That is a very destructive attitude in any relationships, in marriage, in working with children, in any sort of relationships, because it is the opposite of an outgoing love and concern. Love is outgoing concern. It's not a selfish, self-centered approach. It's an outgoing concern. And if we're going to deal effectively, we must have and we must project that kind of love, that kind of concern that's really based on a genuine concern and love for others. The next aspect, the fourth aspect that we might note, is to appreciate the fact that different people have different gifts. Verse 4 says, as we have many members in one body, and all members have not the same office. So we, being many, are one body in Christ, every one members one of another, having then gifts differing. And it goes on and it talks about spiritual gifts. The point is, we're like members of the body. The hands are different than the feet. The ears are different than the mouth. But they all have an important function. One of the problems that so often comes up in terms of child rearing can involve a matter of not appreciating the differences. Every person is different. Every child is different. Different sets of strengths and weaknesses. And if we expect someone to be just like someone else, a child is expected to be just like an older brother or older sister, or to be just like a parent. Well, I like this, and I'm sure you're going to like this too. There are differences in temperament, differences in gifts, and we have to deal with each person as an individual. Parents must deal with their children as individuals, helping the children to identify, to appreciate, and to value the gifts that they have. And one of the primary ways of teaching a child to value the gifts that they have is that we as parents value those different gifts and that we appreciate the fact that every member of the family has different gifts. We're not all identical, and that's okay, because God made us to be different. I think so many times as we look at problems that can come up, that's one of the reasons why, of course, sometimes, because we do have gifts differing one from another, you can put two different people in the same circumstance and they respond to it differently. They have different personality, different temperament, a different approach, and you put two different people in the same circumstance and they will not respond to it in exactly the same way. What to one is a challenge that motivates them to go to greater heights and try harder is to someone else overwhelming and discouraging. And they're just ready to give up. People react differently. We have different strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes parents can be very successful with some children and not nearly so much with others. In a family, particularly if there's several children, there are usually some that the parents find that they can understand more easily because they're more like them. And they can sort of understand how the child is going to respond and react to certain things. And it's very easy then to get frustrated with another child of a different temperament that has to be approached and worked with in a different way. And to sort of assume that they all ought to be the same, and they're not. We have many members in one body, and all members have not the same office, and they have not the same gift. We have gifts differing. We're all different. Appreciating and valuing those differences and working with our children based on their own individuality, on their own individual strengths and weaknesses, on their own talents and abilities, helping them to appreciate and develop and utilize the gifts that they have, not comparing one to another, is a very important key as well. We've got to totally give ourselves to God first and foremost, because if He's not working through us, everything will come to naught. We've got to be changed and transformed in our inner values to convey a different set of values to our children. Otherwise, they will simply absorb what's in the world around them. And they're being bombarded with worldly values at school and through magazines and television and music and movies. And if we are not careful, we can wind up allowing a decadent society to have far, far more influence in shaping their values than we will have. We've got to be transformed in our inner values in order to convey those values. Totally different set of values, recognizing, because as we're transformed in our inner values, we have a basis of recognizing how totally off is the value base of the world. To yield ourselves to God, to be transformed in our inner values and convey those values, to reject a self-centered approach but to deal in love, in outgoing concern, not in a selfish approach, to appreciate and recognize and respect the individuality. As we come on down in verse 9, we're told, let love be without dissimulation. Abhor that which is evil, cleave to that which is good. Let love be without hypocrisy. Sincere love is a very important key. Sincere love. Really loving and caring, and that is something that ties right in with expressing that love. In verse 10, be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love in honor, preferring one another. You see, real love that is expressed through kindness and affection. Real love that is expressed through kindness and affection. This is an important key that must be there if we're going to help to orient our children and to influence them in a positive way toward being a recipient of God's blessing, to really deeply love them and to display that love through kindness and affection. That's an important step. We have that need. Everybody has the need to feel that he's important. We all want to feel like we count. We want to feel like we matter to someone else. There's a need to have that kindness and that affection as we're dealt with, and certainly as a child growing up. To be held and to be loved. To have that love expressed outwardly, affectionately. To be affectionate within the family. So many times, the problems that young people have and that adolescents have is they go elsewhere looking for attention, is because they were not getting that attention at home. Many times, young girls get themselves in a lot of trouble because they're looking for attention. They want somebody, particularly they want their dad, to pay attention to them. And he's busy, he's preoccupied, whatever it may be. It is a great guardian of the family and of building family closeness to realize that real love expressed through kindness and affection has got to play an important part. We can take one another for granted. We can take one another for granted in husbands and wives. You know, these principles apply. Principles of Christianity need to be viewed as not simply theoretical things to be applied in the world around, but the greatest test of our Christianity is what we do with it day in and day out in the context of our home. Anybody can put on something and sort of wear it for a couple of hours once a week at Sabbath services. The real test of our Christianity is not how you act, in the few minutes before and after services interacting with everyone else. The real test of your Christianity is how you act and react and respond day in and day out in your own home, in your own environment, with those to whom you're closest, because it's easy to take for granted. Easy to take for granted one another. Easy for a husband and wife to take one another for granted and to be careless. When a couple is dating, tend to be very conscious of trying to display kindness and courtesy. He'll hold the door and he'll do various things, and there's all this desire to put the best foot forward. That's fine. But it shouldn't stop when a couple is married. That's not the stopping place for kindness and affection. Kindness and affection ought to be something that builds and grows on throughout life. Because that's the way that we really convey to someone, you're special, you count, you're important to me. Dealing with kindness and with affection. A kindness and an affection that grows out of real, sincere love. Genuine love. Not something that's put on, not something that's artificial, but the real thing. So, this becomes a very important key. It's an important part of our Christianity, and it ought to be a very important part of our daily lives in the context of our family. As we come on down, verse 11 tells us not to be slothful in business, not to be lazy in what we do, but fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. Verse 13 tells us, distributing to the necessity of the saints, given the hospitality. You know, this talks about being a productive person through the way that we conduct ourselves. And one of those things, it talks about being given the hospitality, distributing to the necessity of the saints, you know, helping out, being willing to help the needy, particularly needy brethren. Not that we shouldn't help a needy neighbor if we're in a position to, but there is a matter that charity begins at home. We have obligations first and foremost in our own family and then in our spiritual family, our church family. And as we have opportunity and ability to extend it out to anyone with whom we come in contact, if we're in a position to help out, well, that's great. But there is a principle of an approach to life. Principle of an approach to life. A principle of responsibility. That we have a responsibility to be productive and to be giving and sharing and helping. Not just a taking sort of person. Not just to sort of sit back and feel like that the world owes us a living. The world owes us all these things. You know, we're filled with one of the hallmarks of our society is we hear a lot more people talking about their rights and demanding their rights than we hear them talking about their responsibilities. You know, people get all indignant if you're going to take their rights away from them, but they don't seem to get nearly as indignant of the fact of their lack of responsibility in exercising some of those rights and in being irresponsible in terms of the community at large. You know, it is the hallmark of a selfish, self-centered society where everyone becomes preoccupied with himself. This leads into problems in a family, and it leads into problems with children, because when every member of the family is preoccupied with himself, I want my needs met. First and foremost, most important reason for which everyone else exists is to meet my needs. You've got a total distortion of what's right and normal. That's not the way it is. We need to have a sense of responsibility and to convey that sense of responsibility to our children, that there is a sense of responsibility that we have within the family, that we have for one another, that we have in our larger family, in our church family, and in our community. That becomes a major area that is going to affect the way people function together and the ability that we have to reap and receive God's blessings. Because God desires to bless us, and God desires certainly to bless our children. But if we want God's blessings, we need to take seriously the matter of responsibility and realize we have a responsibility to be productive, to give and to contribute, to help, to serve, not to simply go through life as a taker, but to go through life as a producer, as a giver. Now, depending on what our circumstances are, we're able to produce and give in different ways. Everybody's not able to give the same thing. But you can be given to hospitality by a willingness to give what you have. Just because you can't do identical to what somebody else does doesn't mean you can't do anything at all. Another aspect that is very important is brought out in verse 14 where it says, "Bless them that persecute you, bless and curse not." On down in verse 19, or verse 18, it says, "If it be possible, as much as lies within you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, rather give place unto wrath. It's written, vengeance is mine, I'll repay, says the Lord." You know, verse 21 tells us not to be overcome of evil, but to overcome evil with good. When a family breaks down into a spirit of retaliation and getting even, when resentment and bitterness come to be controlling factors in people's lives, so often problems that come down between husbands and wives come down because people are looking to get even. You hurt me, and I'm going to hurt you back. That is not a godly approach toward life. Vengeance belongs to God. Ultimately, God is the only one who can be the arbiter of perfect, righteous justice. And so we're not to avenge ourselves, we're to give place unto wrath. We're to turn loose of bitterness and resentment. Because bitterness and resentment are self-destructive attitudes. They're self-destructive. Bitterness and resentment have to be replaced with forgiveness. Now, forgiveness and reconciliation are not exactly the same thing. You know, it takes one person to forgive, it takes two people to be reconciled. And that's important to understand, because sometimes people are in situations where you can forgive and turn loose of resentment, but you cannot be reconciled to that individual because they haven't changed. You may never have much of a relationship with them until, maybe it's impossible to have until they do. But a spirit and atmosphere of bitterness and resentment is important to be gotten rid of, because it is highly destructive. Many factors here, as we begin to look in, that reflect the way we deal. This is a very important chapter in terms of what real Christianity is all about, that it will reflect itself in our day in and day out affairs. So many times when we go through things like this and we go through scriptures such as these, we tend to apply them to other people, or we tend to apply them to various situations, and not necessarily to apply them right at the starting point, right in the home. Realizing that we have something, we have two aspects in terms of teaching our children. We have, first and foremost, we model a certain behavior for them. We all do, whether it's a good behavior or a bad behavior. We are just like at a fashion show, a model puts on a dress and comes out and walks up and down, and the ladies there can look and see how it looks. They can get a better view of it than just simply hanging on a hanger somewhere. And our concept as children growing up, a lot of what we gain from the behavior that we see modeled, what we see, the example that we see in our home and in our family. That is a very important part of conveying godly values, but that's not all there is. You know, if that's all they did, then it becomes simply a matter that children grow up simply with what's caught rather than what's taught. They pick up a lot, and our example is very important and is perhaps the most crucial part of conveying information. But along with setting an example, there has to be an active teaching. An active teaching is not the same thing as just simply preaching at someone, but taking advantage of circumstances. You know, there are a variety of circumstances in which to teach. You've got a formal instructional situation where you're sitting down, you're talking, maybe a family Bible study, or maybe a specific thing that you more of a formalized instruction where you're specifically sitting down and explaining something you've taken the initiative on. But that is not all there is to teaching. You know, frankly, that's really probably and ought to be a minority of what we're doing teaching, because you can teach just in many informal situations. Sometimes just when you're in the process of doing things, explaining something as you're doing it. That's a good opportunity. Spontaneous questions arise. Things just come up. If you're spending time together, if you're doing things together, things are going to come up. Matters are just sort of raised, and you bring something up, and that provides an opportunity to teach, an opportunity to explain. Now, child rearing goes far beyond simply controlling. And as a young child, you can set boundaries and parameters, and you can exercise control. And it's appropriate that you should. Unfortunately, some never go beyond that. You can teach an animal a trick. You can teach a dog various things of coming or fetching or various things of behavior. An animal can come to learn that certain things are expected of it. And you can do this through repetition, but there's a lot more to teaching a child than there is to training an animal. Because an animal has a brain that operates on a certain level, and it doesn't, once they get on up out of being a puppy or a young, they mature on a very small, a very shallow level. But a child starts out on a very simple level, but that child will continue to develop in its ability and complexity until it reaches adulthood. And if things are merely controlled when the child is young and not taught and internalized to where the child understands why, then as they get older and they're outside of that external control, they don't have the internal basis of holding on to something. So it's important that we actively teach our children, that we model for them what is appropriate behavior, and that we actively teach them, taking advantage of a variety of circumstances, to teach them what's appropriate and why it's appropriate. I think one thing that affects probably all of us as parents is our society has gone downhill so quickly that there were things that you may not have had to have been, clearly or actively taught. You simply absorbed it from the society around in terms of behavior that was appropriate or inappropriate, things that were right and wrong, matters of respect and manners, and even certain concepts of right and wrong in terms of morality. Everything's up for grabs now. We find that it's getting to the point that it's actually a controversial statement in this country to say that a normal heterosexual marriage is preferable to a homosexual relationship. That's a controversial statement. A politician gets up and makes a statement like that, and you've got all sorts of people that think, you shouldn't say that. You shouldn't judge that. Why, these people, this way is just as good as that way. So we've got laws that are being amended in this country to try and put a homosexual relationship on the same legal basis and footing as normal marriage, in terms of various property rights and all sorts of things that we're just sort of recognizing everything as being on the same level. It's not a matter of leaving somebody alone or just letting them be. It's not a matter of harassing somebody. It's a matter of a standard of normalcy of what's right and what's wrong. Something like that would have just simply been unthinkable a matter of a few years ago. You don't have to go back to ancient history to come up with that. There are things in terms of respect and respect for authority and showing respect, concepts of right and wrong and normalcy, things that were just simply absorbed because we lived even a matter of 25, 30 years ago in a society that was a lot more let's say homogeneous. It had a far greater sense of agreement on certain core value issues, and particularly, and as most of us coming from relatively rural areas, small towns, rural areas, farms, villages, that there was a common agreement on many basic things, and you just simply grew up with it. You may not remember it having to be made a big issue of, but what we're looking at right now is we've got a society that is actively teaching children the opposite. Through television, through movies, through music, through school textbooks, class discussions. As parents, we need to educate ourselves and be aware of what is bombarding our children and realize that there's a lot more involved and there's a lot more pressure to actively educate your child on some of these basic, simple things that if we're not careful, we can just assume, well, everybody knows that. No, they don't. And in so many cases, they're being taught exactly the opposite. There is a matter of teaching. That teaching involves a modeling of behavior, and it involves an active teaching and explanation. It goes beyond just simply setting parameters and controls, but teaching actively. And if we're going to properly do that, if we're going to be able to convey the kinds of lessons to our children that can really help them to avail themselves of the opportunities God sets before them, to be a partaker of His blessings, then we need very much to focus on what's brought out right here. We've got to realize we cannot do it on our own. We've got to yield ourselves totally and completely to God, because we can't do what is involved simply on our own strength. We need to be renewed and transformed inwardly in terms of our inner values so that we can transmit them. We need to reject in our own personal lives a self-centered view of life, realizing that selfishness and self-centeredness is destructive to a family and to every larger community. We've got to appreciate and value the differences that every member of the family has, to appreciate and value the individuality, and deal with one another in a way that reflects that. There's got to be sincere, genuine love that's expressed through kindness and affection. There's got to be a sense of responsibility that is felt and is conveyed. There's got to be an attitude of peaceableness, not an attitude of resentment and retaliation. These approaches to life will shape our families and will shape our futures.